May the moonlight.
Hello? Yeah. No, don't need any introduction. John's going to sing for you, apparently.
You've had it. That's it.
So hello, welcome to the panel with John Wagner, a man that needs no introduction really, a British legend with comics. So I guess we'll start by talking about how did you get involved with writing? How did you start?
Well, I started, I was living with an aunt, and I think she wanted rid of me. And so she brought me this advert from the Glasgow Evening News, was it? Called it for editorial assistants at DC Thompson's in Dundee. And she said, "Here, John, why don't you go and live in Dundee?" So I applied for the job and I got it, and I lasted a couple of years in extreme poverty at DC Thompson's, but I learned my trade and then went freelance, working with Pat Mills, who you all have heard of, across in his shed in Fife. I actually went back to Dundee 15 or so years ago, and a chap that worked at the Courier was showing me around, and we drove across the Tay Bridge to Wormit, where Pat had his house, and I finally identified the house, and I went and knocked on the door, and a woman answered. I said to her, "Do you mind if we photograph your shed?" And she looked a bit puzzled but said, "No, not at all." So we took some photos of the shed and put it up on Facebook, and the fans christened it the Thrill Shed. So that's how I got into it, pretty much.
I mean, that shed's quite iconic because that's where you guys created Judge Dredd, isn't it?
No.
It's not?
No, Dredd came well after that. Yeah, that's where we created things like the Can-Do Kids and Yellowknife of the Yard and School for Snobs. Now, Pat had the most difficult thing about starting a freelance career is actually getting yourself noticed. And Pat had the brilliant idea that we should choose a comic. In this case, it was Core. Does everyone remember Core? It was a one-page funnies mainly that IPC published, and Pat had the brilliant idea that we should write one of every strip. And so we wrote 23 strips for Core, put them in an envelope and sent them off to the editor. And if 23 strips comes in one envelope, you can't ignore that. And he actually bought 12 of them. So we were sort of off and running.
So you touched a little bit already about sort of how hard it can be as a freelancer, and as you've well established over the years now. How does that process differ from starting out and doing the freelance work to sort of working for sort of more established comics?
Not quite sure I understand. I only have experience of doing it the way I did it. I imagine if you're, it's even harder if you've got no connections and you're just sending in stray scripts and hoping that the editorial will take notice of you, because, for instance, on 2000 AD, there is only one editor, only one editor to handle all the editorial, and he hasn't really got a lot of time for reading unsolicited submissions. That was actually my first job at DC Thompson's. I was in this department called Fiction that they put you in if they thought, well, you might be of use, but they weren't quite sure. You know, people would come along to choose. Various editors would come along to choose staff from Fiction department, but nobody seemed to want me. So I was, one of my jobs was reading submissions that came in. You know, people would send in short stories, often of a religious bent, and we would have to read them and send out either rejection slips called Rep 1 and Rep 2. Which is Rep 1 was, well, you might be of use to us. Rep 2 is, please never contact us again. Or writing a nice letter to say, oh, we like that, you know. So, in all my time there, I only discovered one useful writer. But that was one of my first jobs. Another one was editing Mills and Boon books for the evening newspaper. Yeah. That's where I learned how to cut material. Like you would run a Mills and Boon book for 2 weeks in the evening newspaper, and there was only so much space, so you probably have to cut out about half the book. But with a Mills and Boon book, that is very easy. So you just go through rubbish.
So you touched already about your sort of collaboration that you've had with Pat over the years, but can you tell us how the idea of Judge Dredd came about in the first place?
Well, Pat was working on developing 2000 AD, and he liked someone to throw ideas off and discuss ideas with, so he brought me in. Actually, the publisher didn't like me, so Pat had to do it sneakily. Like, he couldn't pay me any money, so he had to write scripts and then pay them to me, which is sometimes why I get royalties for scripts that I have no idea what they are, because Pat wrote them and paid me for them. Anyway, we would go over the material he had for the comic and talk about it and discuss improvements. And I noticed that one thing he didn't have was a future cop. I'd been working on Valiant and had introduced a character called One-Eyed Jack, based loosely on Dirty Harry and any number of near-corrupt detectives. And when I introduced it in Valiant, it shot to the top of the popularity poll. It was double the popularity of the previous top story. So I knew it worked, and I said to Pat, well, that's a story you haven't got. I also had a ref of this character called, I think it was called Mannix. It was some kind of future cop, and he went around killing people all the time. And I thought, well, that's pretty good. The character would be, well, Pat had another character called Judge Dredd that he was using, who was an occult detective, and the story wasn't working. You know, it didn't inspire any real enjoyment. And I said, well, can we use that title for this character? He'll be judge, jury, and executioner, mainly executioner. My original concept of Dredd, he was a much nastier person than the sweet character that we know now. My first script actually involved him running over a jaywalker with his bike, and as he lies there mangled, he's pointing a gun at him and saying, if you can get to the curb, you live. Well, not surprisingly, they didn't run that one. So that's pretty much how Dredd came about.
So you've written Dredd for a long time now. How do you keep that sort of motivation and the different ideas going for the same characters?
Well, you just think of different aspects of it. And when I was working with Alan Grant, one of the things we used to do is just take the daily newspaper and we sit down and we go through the newspaper and look at each different story and say, well, how could you extrapolate that into the future? What's the future version of that story? And how would things have changed? And so you've got this continual refreshment of ideas just from things that happen today. And the funny thing about Dredd is that there's nothing that goes on in Dredd apart from some of the futurism that isn't going on in the world someplace today. When you look at Iran or Russia or North Korea. No, not Glasgow. So I mean, there's so many. I've written stories based on a remark overheard on a bus, and you know, you just get ideas from everywhere. But it does get harder, you know, when you've done 40 years of Dreads. It's difficult, especially as I never read other people's scripts, and so now occasionally I write a script and the editor will say, "Oh, sorry, somebody's done that," or "Somebody's killed that character off," or it's like Hershey recently. I wrote a story, her death, and Matt said, "Oh no, somebody's using her later on." So there had to be a miracle resurrection. Anyway.
So one of the things that's been happening this year is the re-release of Bogeyman. And can you tell us about how that came about in the first place and how popular it was at the time?
Yeah, Alan and I, we wrote picture strip for Eagle, a photo strip for Eagle when it came out, and that was a lot of fun. We did characters like Doomlord, you know, thinking of how you could cheaply recreate space effects, like his spaceship was a colander with a light stuck in it. And but one of the characters we did was called Joe Soap. He was an incompetent detective. And Dave Hunt, the editor, said to us they used this agency for actors called the Ugly Agency, where, you know, they had a lot of ugly people working for, strange looking people, or character actors. And one day Dave Hunt said to us, "Oh look, we can get this actor that does Humphrey Bogart, could you use him?" So we came up with this story where this plausible Humphrey Bogart type character teams up with Joe Soap and leads them on a merry dance about this case that doesn't actually exist, and it turns out he's a total lunatic. And we liked the idea a hell of a lot, and we were so delighted when Eagle stopped using PhotoStrip and they never used that story, so we tucked it away. We tried to sell it to DC, moving him across to San Francisco, but DC thought there was no market for such a story. And then Robin Smith, the artist, had been talking to John McShane of ACME Books and Comics fame, and John and his partner George Jackson wanted to publish something. And Robin said, "Well, why don't you move the person we now call the Bogeyman to Glasgow?" And that was it, you know. He just came alive then, because it was 89, and the next year Glasgow was the European City of Culture, and it was a perfect atmosphere to launch Bogey in. So we set him up. He was an inmate of a lunatic asylum in Greenock, where I grew up. I sent my sister up there with a camera to this very sinister hospital called Ravenscraig. She took pictures. It became Spin Binny. And Spin Bin is Glasgow slang for asylum. And my mother lived in Inverkip at the time, and we made that Bogey's home, and my mother became Bogey's mother. Anyway, we wrote for a 4-issue comic series just called The Bogeyman, and John McShane and George Jackson, they worked miracles publicising it and getting it into Scottish bookstores. And I'm not sure how many the first issue sold, but I think it was 28 or 29,000, which for an independent comic, well, it's still the biggest selling independent comic in Britain ever. And sadly, we didn't know this, but John and George were financing it on their credit cards and going badly overdrawn. So when the BBC approached us, and I think with some encouragement from John and George, to make a 1 hour special, they ended up, the bank foreclosed on all the money, and out of the special, Alan Grant and I, my co-writer, made £175 each. And I don't know if Robin Smith saw any money, but the bank foreclosed on all the money. We never made any royalties. George died not long after that. Everyone fell out with each other. We began to call it, instead of the Bogeyman, the Scottish comic. Just not to bring any more bad luck down on us. We thought it was cursed. But it was a labor of love. We went on to write a second book for Tundra Atomica, Kevin Eastman's setup in London, called Chinatown, which was, to my mind, even better than the first Bogeyman. In the meantime, we badly fell out with Robin, and well, anyway. So finally, it's become very hard to get hold of the original Bogeyman books, and I didn't want it to die. So we agreed that we would do this collection of the Bogeyman, leaving out one story about Bogey's trip to New York, because it doesn't fit with the whole Bogey thing, and where he would kidnap the Vice President, Dan Quayle. So we left that out, but the rest of it is there, as well as a story that we wrote for the magazine called Return to Casablanca, Casablanca being Edinburgh, and a special 6-pager that I wrote for the book, featuring the number of people, at least one person in this room. We sold a lot of slots in the comic and got people to send us their photos, and they got drawn into the story. And Phil here is a cop. A cop, yeah. So we got a nice, more than 280 pages of strip in the book, and it's selling like hotcakes today.
It's been very popular, I've been told, yeah. You talked about that there was the adaptation of it that didn't go down too well at the time. Would you like to see a new adaptation of it?
Yeah, I'd love to see somebody like Steve Martin in the role of Bogey. But yeah, I'd love to see an adaptation, a proper one. The thing was, they gave it to a writer whose career was flagging, and he imposed himself all over the script. He changed it so that it made no sense. And I'm told that just before filming, the director called him aside and said, "Paul, this isn't funny anymore." So he stuck all our jokes back in it, but in the wrong place. It made no sense at all. They showed it on Christmas Eve. Robbie Coltrane in the lead role, and I really like Robbie Coltrane, or I did. But he played it as if Bogey knew he was a loon, and that's the last thing. Bogey's dead serious about his character, so it seemed very tongue-in-cheek, and that was wrong, and he should have been told that. And they showed it Christmas Eve opposite Gorillas in the Mist. I'm glad to say very few people saw it. I had it on tape, but I wiped it.
So quite a lot of your work has been adapted over the years, and some of it been popular, some of it not so popular. Is there anything that you would like to see adapted in the future, apart from just Bogeyman, any other stories that haven't been yet?
Well, I'd love to see Rock of the Reds made into a continuing TV series, or even just a good film. I don't know why people haven't been banging at my door for it, but they haven't. Button Man, I probably sold an option on Button Man about 10 different times, and I've no doubt made more money out of the options than I would have if they actually made the film. But I would like to see that. I would like to see a Button Man film. But principally, Rock of the Reds. I would like to see that on the screen. But what we did with the Bogeyman, I don't know how many of you saw the Kickstarter, but we did a 4-hour video, 4-minute video for it, and using the art from the comic and voiceover, like I did Bogey's voice, and Cam Kennedy's wife was Dr. Branch, and we got people from Allen's Village to be Bogey's girlfriend, and a cop, and we did a 4-minute video, and it was so good that it made me think it would be good to do the Bogeyman or even Rock of the Reds as an actual, what they call a motion comic. Have any of you actually seen any motion comics? They've done them on Watchmen, and people tell me it's not bad. Yeah. But we'd like to do a full hour-and-a-half motion comic of the Bogeyman. And I do a pretty good Bogey voice, I can tell you. The rain was coming down.
So you spoke about Rock of the Reds already, and that's something that you've kind of been all over promoting the past few years. How did that idea come about and that collaboration come about?
Rock of the Reds, that was another one that sprang from Eagle. It's a story called Doomlord that we did, and Doomlord was an alien servitor of Nox who was sent to Earth to judge the human race, and kind of fell in love with humans even though he found them guilty. But Alan Grant and I decided foolishly that we'd create a whole new anthology comic. This was probably back in the 90s sometime. And we needed a football story. And we were racking up, what can you do in football that's not been done before? And it came about, we thought, well, what about an alien footballer? So we used the basic concept of Doomlord. Actually, one of the reasons we did it was that we discovered that these people called the Dan Dare Corporation had bought the rights to Doomlord. And I got my lawyer in New York to write to them, to threaten them, tell them that they didn't have the right to make a film of Doomlord, because I'd been consultant on Dread 2, and DNA Films were interested in making a film of Doomlord, and obviously I wanted to do that. They wanted it set in Port Glasgow, which appealed. Then I found out that the Dan Dare Corporation had the rights and they couldn't do it. So I got my lawyer to threaten them, and we're sort of at an impasse. They won't use it and we won't use it. But then I thought, well, let's take the basic concept of Doomlord, which is an alien coming to Earth and going native, and let's make it a football story. And that's how Rock came about. A bit more humorous than Doomlord was, but Doomlord was quite funny too. And it fitted in quite well. Although sadly DNA Films were not interested in the football version of Doomlord. Well, that's how that came about.
So you've been part of some writing dream teams over the years, but you've also written by yourself. How does that process differ being part of a team and writing your own stuff?
Well, it can work very well, and it can be a pain in the neck. Pat Mills and I lasted about a year before we nearly came to blows. Everybody has their own ideas of how a story should go, and sometimes the tension just build up. And when I found us sort of standing up and facing off against each other, I said, right, it's time to break this up. And so I quit, and I went down to London and worked in the office for a while. Alan Grant and I, having been friends for quite a long time, we got on pretty well, so it was just, we'd just sit around and throw ideas back and forth, and as I was a sort of more experienced guy, he kind of deferred to me, which made things a lot easier, because this is where I sing.
Just have to wait a second, you can't hear it work, so it's announcing the photos, but you can sing if you want.
It makes things a lot easier if you're not arguing about things too much. So that worked pretty well with Alan and I, and especially on certain kinds of stories like action. It really helps to have two minds working on things. Humor, especially humor. You have an instant editor that you can tell whether a joke's funny or a joke's not, whether a situation's working for the best. But when you come to something like a strip with a strong emotional content, like the strip that we were working on after about 8 years, a strip we were working on called The Last American, and we were getting nowhere with it. It was just single sentences. We were arguing over them, how it should go. And another one was a strip we were doing called Oz, Chopper in Oz, and Alan wanted to kill him at the end, and I had learned by bad experience, don't kill characters. Like Johnny Alpha, that was a bad move, something I'll live to regret. So it just seemed the time, we weren't getting anywhere with anything, so the time had come to split up, and it worked out pretty well for both of us. I mean, Alan went on to have a brilliant career doing detective comics and with DC, and well, I just went back to Dredd and all the other characters I created. So it works well if you're writing certain subjects. That's why you always get comedy teams like Galton and Simpson and Norden and Muir. It's a big help. Ben Elton and Rowan, whatever Atkinson is, him. Funny guy.
So you just touched on that briefly about sort of the American comics and the British comics. Is there this big difference between creating something for that audience versus the British audience?
I don't think I'm really the one to ask about creating for America, because I didn't do that much of it. I never particularly got on with the subject matter that I liked. I mean, I don't like superheroes, and I've never enjoyed writing them. In fact, I don't think I have written them, apart from Batman, but I don't consider him a superhero. I suppose the nearest I've come to a superhero is Rock. But I haven't actually created that much for America. The things I did didn't seem to work that well either. But I wrote, things did work, like Boba Fett and the Star Wars stuff. I fitted in quite well there. But, no, I'm not the man to ask about America.
So you've been part of some big storylines and characters that you've created over the years. Is there any that kind of particular favourites to you?
Well, I think I've covered them at The Rock, and The Boogeyman, and a lot of Judge Dredd stories have worked really well, especially like one-offs. A one-off is really difficult to write. They're harder than a series because you can't just have a cliffhanger ending and then figure out what you're going to do with it next week. It's got to be a nice rounded story with beginning, middle and end, and be satisfying within that. So they are difficult to do. And the book that I've actually sold out of today, The Best of My Judge Dredds, has a lot of really good, one-offs that work really well. So things like Bury My Knee at Wounded Heart, which is a title I'd struggled for many years to make sense of, based on Bury My Heart at Wounded Knee. And finally I figured out, well, somebody was called Knee, you can make that work. And stories like Love Story and It Pays to Be Mental. That book is full of nice one-offs. And obviously the longer story America that sort of helped launch the magazine. That was a story I'm very fond of, and it's created quite a continuing storyline within Dredd. So you're running out of questions.
So as part of kind of the whole Judge Dredd community, there's a big cosplay scene. How does it feel seeing your characters come to life?
It's interesting. Yeah, I like to see phalanxes of judges, but I also like to see other people's characters. I used to really dislike cosplay, but now I think it adds a lot of colour to conventions, and when it's done well, it's very interesting. Like there's one girl, Joanne from Northern Ireland, that does just a brilliant martial law. Have you seen her martial law? It's really good, and I like cosplay. It's mainly judges of my characters. You see an occasional Johnny Alpha. Haven't seen an Ace Garp. I'd like to see one of those. Or a Feek the Freak. Or a Rock. I'd like to see a few bogeymen about, duffing convention goers up.
So going back to your writing career, have you got any advice for any aspiring writers in the audience?
Advice? Well, I usually have 3 bits of advice, but I've forgotten them. No, the main one is I learned at DC Thompson's is being self-critical. There's nothing that I've written that couldn't be written better. So when you write something, have a look at it and ask yourself, how could the scene be improved? How could the dialogue be improved? How could the characters' actions make more sense? And just keep looking at your script and your story. And one of the troubles with a lot of budding writers is that they can't see past what they've done. They submit a story and they can't accept any criticism. Whereas I've always been really self-critical and never quite been satisfied with what I do. And also my method helps me in that, because every day when I come back to a story, I go over what I've done the day before or the week before. And so by the time I've finished the story, I've gone over some sections of it and changed them maybe 10, 15 times. It's a long story. Just to extract more out of it, to get a better joke, better character interaction, better action altogether. So the main one is self-criticism. And I genuinely forget my other bits of advice. But that's the main one. That was, E.C. Thompson's didn't let you get away with anything. You know, if you got something wrong, you got told about it. And it's important that you don't think you're perfect.
So are there any sort of things you're working on at the moment or future plans that you can tell us about?
Yeah, a full retirement. Yeah, I'm not. Perhaps the motion comic, I might get that together. It would be a lot easier to kickstart something like that, for instance, because we wouldn't need a printer. Now, the printing costs on Rock, the Rock book, were £8,000. And you know, it takes a lot of your capital, and it means you've got to earn far more from your Kickstarter. And just the postage costs are going to come to something like £6,000, posting them out, and then you get the returns. You get people saying, "Oh, my poster's been damaged," or "the book never came," or "I had a poster returned from Germany." So, you know, I've got to repost that and get a different address for the guy, and it's just a total hassle, and it's very expensive. I did a Kickstarter on, I don't think that's what the question's about, but I'm going to answer it. I did a Kickstarter on Rock 2, and even though we pulled in about £21,000 on it, but I still ended up in debt. I've never been paid for a Rock script. I probably ended up about £5,000-6,000 in debt from that Kickstarter, just because it simply wasn't enough to cover the costs. Because I paid the artists, I paid the colourer, I paid the letterer, but I didn't pay me. That's why I desperately try and foist all these books on you when you come up to me. Oh, you should read this, really good. But I would like to try the motion comic, either the Bogeyman or Rock. I'm not sure I could do Rock's voice, but I can do Bogey. Because if we did anything, it would just be a DVD. We just send that out, or it could all be done digitally, and that would be nice and cheap, and I wouldn't have to make so much money from the Kickstarter. It wouldn't be such a hassle. I wouldn't have to create all these add-ons, you know, and extras, and send out posters, and cajole people, and twist arms. So I'm thinking of doing that anyway, and possibly on the cards is Rock Book 3, but this latest Kickstarter has been so much hassle that I'm having severe doubts about it. I've told Dan Cornwell, the artist, well, you do it this time and see how you like it. So, apart from that, I don't know. I'd like to move back to Scotland. I'd like to do less work. Vegetate.
Well, thanks for that, John. It was a great panel, and I think we've got time for a couple of questions. So I'm just gonna. Does anybody have any questions?
Sadly, with the loss of Carlos, I know that Strontium Dog is, for want of a better term, a semi-retirement. I was just wondering, what if you had any plans for Johnny Alpha, and if so, what were they after the storyline, The Sun?
No, I didn't actually, and strangely enough, it seems a very apt place for the story to end. But having thought about it for a while, although I don't want to write it without Carlos, I said to Matt, if he can find the right team for it, he can carry it on. I know that Edgar Wright would love to make a Strontium Dog film. Carlos and I had dinner with him in London a few years ago, and I really don't know why he and Rebellion can't get that together, because I think he'd make a very good Strontium Dog film. So I'd like to see that happen. And I don't mind if a decent writing. I think Michael Carroll has some good ideas on Strontium Dog. And by God, Henry Flint can really get Carlos. And you see his artwork on Major Easy recently, that was as near to Carlos as I've ever seen. Although I imagine it's quite hard to do. So I would be quite happy to see Strontium Dog go on, but not handled badly.
Hello. I was just wondering your viewpoint of Hoven and then Robocop. We used a lot of judge-friendly lines.
Have to speak up, it's really speaking.
Sorry, I'm soft spoken.
Yeah.
I was just wondering your viewpoint of when Paul Verhoeven made Robocop, but used a lot of judge-friendly lines. What was your viewpoint on that?
Well, you know, it didn't bother me that much. We all feed off each other, you know. I'm not shy of borrowing things myself. So, you know, if he wants to take that, fine. He made a pretty good film, I thought. So, more power to him. Although if he wanted to send me 10 grand, I'd be very happy.
Any other questions?
John, oh God, that's loud. Hey John, thank you for all the creations over the years. It's been absolutely incredible, and I do hope you carry on. Can I ask a two-parter? So Dread's been in 2 movies. Do you have any thoughts as to what they got right and what they got wrong? And are you involved in this long gestating Rebellion TV show for Dread, or is that not something that you're involved with?
Well, the first one got a lot right, but sadly the plot wasn't one of those things. The recreation of the city was pretty good. It's because they had back then a budget of about 80 million, and that was quite a lot of money back then, and the recreation was pretty good. Actually, Stallone got 15 million of that, I'm told. He didn't throw any my way either. So they got that right, but the plot wrong. And that was big, and there were a lot of stupidities in it, like a clone of Dredd should have been played by Stallone. It was played, you know, I can't remember who the guy was, it'll do. Was it Armando Sante? Yeah. The second film, the only thing I particularly objected to was the early 20th century vehicles in the opening chase. But it was a pretty good chase, and I think they got, within the budget that they had, they made a pretty fair recreation of Dredd, and they stayed true to Dredd. So I was much happier with that. I wasn't involved at all in the TV series. I was ignored. They did send me the script to read, but when I came to the 10-foot talking polar bear, I sort of switched off.
Any other questions? No? Well, thank you very much for that, John. That was a great panel.
Thank you, and thank you for coming.